diversity, equity, inclusion. Unless you've removed yourself from all forms of communication over the past few years, these words are familiar to you. Familiarity, though, is not enough to evoke change. Without passion and purpose, familiarity leads to apathy. I know in my own life, there are many things that I am familiar with. I'm just apathetic in talking about them. For example, my spouse's obsession with reality TV. Now, if you give me something that I am passionate about, I become an advocate for that thing. If our goal is to create lasting and impactful change in this space of DEI, we must be willing to challenge our own apathy and step into a role of advocacy. As advocates, we get the opportunity to build deep, meaningful relationships with others across difference and work towards challenging inequities that lead to exclusion. 2.5 years ago, I found myself face to face with my own apathy. I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about all of the different times we had been pulled over as teenagers. I told him that by the time I was 18 years old, I had received 6 speeding tickets and 1 careless and reckless. Yes, my parents were extremely excited to get me off of their insurance plan. He then began to tell me his story. And he stated that one time he got pulled over coming home from school in his dad's car. The officer forced him out of the vehicle, searched him, and questioned him intensely about the ownership of the car. This caused my friend to fear for his safety. I recognized in that moment that my model of the world as a white man was drastically different than that of my friends. You see, I had countless encounters with the police, but not once did I fear for my safety. This shed light on a very real privilege that I have, one that I had not been using in an effective way. In a sense, I was apathetic to the fact that others experience challenges simply because of their diverse traits. Having this conversation with my friend led me down a path of self-awareness and action. My goal today is to share with you my story as well as the steps that I have taken and continue to take so that you are equipped with the tools to help you navigate your own path from apathy toward advocacy. To truly understand how pivotal that conversation with my friend was, I have to take you back in my history. You see, I grew up in a very small town in eastern North Carolina. Y'all recognize the accent? The town that I grew up in, the school that I attended, wasn't very diverse, and most of the kids got along, which meant as an early young adult or even a child, I created this model of the world that things like discrimination just didn't exist. Well, here's the thing. I knew they existed, but I kept telling myself that was my parents' generation. We've moved beyond that. After all, it's the 90s. You take these experiences that I gained as a child and you add to that the belief that my parents instilled in me that I should treat each person I encounter with a deep level of respect. And then you send this kid off to college. Well, it was in college that I began to meet other people with different backgrounds. And as I began to hear their stories, what I was seeing is these issues of racism and sexism and homophobia were not issues of the past that my parents dealt with. They were very real and very present in these moments. This created cognitive dissonance for me because as a young college student, I so wanted to hold on to the idea that society had moved beyond these issues. But I was hearing story after story where that just wasn't true. Let's fast forward a few years. I've now started my career. And as a manager, I get introduced to my company's business resource groups that are focused on generating appreciation and awareness for others' perspectives and experiences. But in this time in my career, I was still pretty apathetic, and I told myself, as a white, straight, cisgendered man, I don't have a group for me, so I avoided joining them. A few years later into my career, I made a transition and became a learning facilitator focused on teaching diversity to leaders. And it was in those classes that I had the opportunity to hear story after story from other people of how their experiences led to inequity because of their differences. Y'all sensing a pattern here? Well, this time it was different for me because not only was I hearing these stories from my teammates, this was also about the same time that I had that conversation with my friend. And I'm now faced with this challenge or this question. What do I do? Because this model of the world that I created as a young child was falling apart, and I'm realizing that it was simply a facade. And I'm also realizing that I've been sitting on the sidelines, not effectively helping initiate change. I had to take action. I had to recognize my own apathy and start my journey toward advocacy. One thing I've learned on this journey, the work is not comfortable. After all, it requires me to own up to my mistakes and willingly challenge the deep-rooted beliefs and behaviors that I have demonstrated that lead to system of oppression for others. Remember when I told you growing up I didn't see any overt forms of discrimination? Well, what I realize now is because I didn't want to. I was really comfortable in my privilege. And challenging that or looking into that would have created a level of discomfort that I wasn't ready for. The brain is not wired to seek after things that make us uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, we look for patterns of safety and security to help us avoid risk. So as we navigate our journeys towards advocacy, we have to be willing to lean into discomfort and actively work towards changing our mindset. One of the things that's helped me change my own mindset is realizing that when I interact with other people, I want them to know that I care more about them as a person than I do my own sense of comfort. What has helped me navigate this journey are 4 steps that I'm going to share with you today. Those steps that I have picked up in my work as a DEI practitioner. The first step that we can take as we step into advocacy is to recognize our own bias. And this is a challenging step because most of our biases are unconscious, meaning within 1/10 of a second, I've made my decision about my interaction with you as a person. But there is hope. There is a tool that we can use to help us surface these unconscious biases. That tool is known as the Johari window, and it consists of 4 quadrants. It is the arena, the facade, the blind spot, and the unknown. Our goal on this journey is to move all of our biases into the arena. Now, this is difficult because it requires me to not only admit my mistakes and my biases to myself, which I have a hard enough time doing, I've also got to bring other people into the conversation and practice vulnerability and let them know I have the bias as well. Even though this is uncomfortable, when we take that step, we are able to recognize and challenge our biases. The second area our biases can land in is the facade. And this is a little easier to process because this is where I'm aware of the bias, but other people are not. And if I'm aware of it, then I can do the work. I can challenge the bias. I can make sure that my behaviors are not consistent with the biases that I have. And that's all well and good. But what happens is even when we are actively working towards challenging our biases, some of them creep out in the form of unconscious behavior. So, if we can bring those biases into the arena, we get the opportunity to allow others to share with us how our behaviors are negatively impacting other people. The third area we find our biases in is the blind spot. And this is a difficult area to surface because it means I am not aware of the bias, but other people are. Therefore, I have to open myself up to feedback from other people. And let's face it, none of us really want to do that. Remember, the brain doesn't like things that make us uncomfortable. But when I do this, and I practice this level of vulnerability, I'm able to hear others' experiences with me, and then I can surface those biases and work towards changing the behavior. The final area we find our biases in is the unknown. And this is where I'm not aware of the bias, and no one else is either. Typically, when we start this journey towards advocacy, most of our biases land here. I don't know what I don't know. It's through education and experience that we can surface these biases and work towards bringing them into the arena. As we take this first step in recognizing and challenging the bias, we then get the opportunity to take the second step. And that step is to remain curious. In the book, The Art of Connecting, the authors state, it is impossible to be both curious and judgmental at the same time. So when we embrace curiosity, we get the opportunity to build deep, meaningful relationships with other people, and what comes from that is the ability to bring our unknown biases into the arena. Now, the goal shouldn't be in building these relationships to have self-awareness, but it is certainly a byproduct of doing so. One thing we have to understand as we're starting this journey towards advocacy, it is not the responsibility of other people to teach me how my behaviors have created systems of oppression that negatively impact them. Therefore, the second part of this step is be willing to do the work yourself. There are countless resources out there that teach you about inequity and systems of oppression so that you are not having to go to your trusted circle of friends to be a one-stop shop on all things bias. The next step we take on this journey is to stretch ourselves and expand our constellation of input. Remember when I told you that I was apprehensive in joining the business resource groups early in my career? Well, since then, I've been a member of every one of those resource groups. And that has given me the opportunity to build connections with people that I never would have built a connection with prior to that. You see, before these business resource groups, when I made a decision, I went to people who looked, acted, and thought just like I did. But now I have a circle of diverse people that I can go to, and that helps me make better decisions. The fourth step that we take is challenge the status quo. Stepping into a role of advocacy means willingness to challenge inequities when we see them happening. True advocacy is so much more than putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard or a Love is Love sticker on your car. We have to be willing to speak truth to power and challenge bias wherever we see it, regardless of whether it's our boss, our best friend, or even a family member. Now, the role of advocate is not the role of a savior. It is not my responsibility to save anyone, but it is my responsibility to recognize when and where I have privilege, use that privilege in an effective way, and be willing to recognize that familiarity with inequity is not enough. We have to take action. These 4 steps are not all-inclusive. There are more things that you can do as you navigate your journey. But if you begin taking these 4 steps, you will be able to move away from apathy and into a role of advocacy. You've heard a lot of my story today. And some of you may be hearing this and saying, hey, I recognize that I've been apathetic, and it's time for me to embrace this journey towards advocacy. Others may be hearing this and saying, I've been an advocate for a while. Either way, it is our responsibility to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table. Sometimes that means taking the spotlight off of me and putting it onto other people. Other times, it means recognizing who built the table, destroying the table, and starting over fresh. As we come to a close, my question for you is this: how will you use these steps to help you navigate your own journey from apathy to advocacy? After all, when we take the steps on this journey, we embrace equity and inclusion, and that truly makes the world a better place.